In the winter of 1878, Eleanor Ravenwood inherited more than just a Victorian mansion in rural Massachusetts. She inherited the sound of footsteps that walked beneath her floors every night at exactly 11:47. Conversations in hushed tones that seemed to rise from the very foundation of her home. And a library where the floorboards creaked with the weight of secrets that had been buried for decades. What Eleanor discovered beneath those ancient wooden planks would reveal that her family's fortune was built not on honor, but on the systematic betrayal of desperate souls seeking freedom. Before we continue with Eleanor's terrifying discovery at Ravenwood Manor, I want to ask you to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our darkest stories. And please, let us know in the comments what city and country you're watching from. We love connecting with our audience around the world. Your support means everything to us as we uncover these forgotten mysteries together. But now, let's return to that cold February morning when Eleanor first set foot in her inherited home. According to the fragmented records and whispered stories that have been passed down through generations in the small towns near the Massachusetts-New Hampshire border, what happened at Ravenwood Manor challenges everything we thought we knew about heroism during America's darkest chapter. The year 1878 found rural Massachusetts still healing from the wounds of the Civil War, though the scars ran deeper in some places than others. Near the border with New Hampshire, where dense forests gave way to rolling farmland, the small community of Millbrook had always prided itself on its role in the Underground Railroad. Local families spoke with quiet pride of their ancestors who had risked everything to help enslaved people reach freedom in the north. Ravenwood Manor stood like a Gothic cathedral among the bare winter trees, its dark stone facade and towering spires visible from the main road that connected Millbrook to the larger towns beyond. The mansion had been built in 1847 by Eleanor's grandfather, Cornelius Ravenwood, a wealthy textile merchant who had made his fortune during the industrial boom that transformed New England in the mid-1800s. The locals had always viewed the Ravenwoods with a mixture of respect and distance. They were the wealthy family on the hill, generous with the church and cordial at town gatherings, but ultimately separate from the daily struggles of farming and millwork that defined life in Millbrook. Eleanor Ravenwood was 24 when she received the telegram informing her of her uncle's death. Having grown up in Boston, she had visited the manor only a handful of times during her childhood, and those visits were brief, formal affairs where children were expected to be seen and not heard. Her memories of the place were hazy: tall ceilings that seemed to swallow voices, portraits of stern-faced ancestors watching from gilded frames, and rooms that felt perpetually cold despite the massive fireplaces that dominated each space. The inheritance came as a surprise. Eleanor had assumed the manor would pass to one of her male cousins, as was customary, but her uncle's will was specific. The house, the land, and all its contents were to go to Eleanor, along with a modest trust that would allow her to maintain the property. The lawyer who handled the estate, a nervous man named Harrison Webb, had seemed almost relieved to hand over the keys and retreat to his carriage with unusual haste. Eleanor's first week at Ravenwood Manor passed quietly enough. The house came with Mrs. Catherine Whitmore, a stern woman in her 60s who had served as housekeeper for the past 15 years. Mrs. Whitmore maintained the manor with military precision, ensuring fires were lit before dawn, meals appeared at precise intervals, and every surface gleamed despite the house's perpetual battle against dust and dampness. She spoke little beyond what was necessary for the daily operations of the household, but Eleanor noticed how the woman's eyes would dart towards certain rooms as they passed, and how she always found reasons to avoid the library after dark. It was the library that drew Eleanor's attention most strongly. The room occupied the entire east wing of the manor's ground floor, its walls lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes that chronicled everything from agricultural techniques to philosophical treatises. Heavy oak tables sat beneath tall windows that faced the forest, and a massive fireplace dominated the far wall, flanked by built-in bookcases that held the most valuable texts in the collection. The room smelled of old paper, leather bindings, and something else. Something earthy and damp that seemed to rise from the floorboards themselves. During those first few days, Eleanor spent hours in the library, sorting through her uncle's papers and trying to make sense of the family's financial records. The Ravenwood fortune, while not as vast as it had once been, was still substantial. There were investments in textile mills, shares in shipping companies, and deeds to various properties throughout New England. But there were also gaps in the records, periods where significant sums of money had been spent or earned without clear documentation of their source or purpose. It was on her 8th night at Ravenwood Manor that Eleanor first heard the sounds beneath the library floor. She had been working late, reading through a collection of her grandfather's business correspondence by lamplight, when she became aware of a rhythmic creaking that seemed to come from directly below her feet. At first, she assumed it was the old house settling, the natural sounds that any structure of that age would make during the cold February nights. But as she listened more carefully, the sounds took on a disturbing pattern. There were footsteps, slow, deliberate steps that moved from one end of the space beneath the library to the other. Then silence. Then the steps would begin again, pacing back and forth with the mechanical persistence of someone trapped in a very small space. Eleanor set down her papers and moved quietly across the library floor, following the sounds. They seemed strongest near the center of the room, where a large Persian rug covered the dark wood planks. She mentioned the sounds to Mrs. Whitmore the next morning during breakfast, expecting a rational explanation about settling foundations or perhaps mice in the walls. Instead, the housekeeper's face went pale, and she set down her coffee cup with trembling hands. "You mustn't pay attention to those sounds, miss," Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Old houses make all manner of noises. It's best not to dwell on such things." But Eleanor could see the fear in the woman's eyes, the way she glanced toward the library door, as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. When pressed for more information, Mrs. Whitmore claimed she had never heard anything unusual, though she admitted she avoided the library after sunset whenever possible. That evening, Eleanor positioned herself in the library before dusk, determined to document exactly what she was hearing. She brought a notebook and pencil, planning to record the times and duration of any sounds. As darkness fell outside the tall windows, she lit several oil lamps to push back the gloom and settled into one of the leather chairs near the fireplace. The sounds began at exactly 11:47, just as they had the night before. But this time, Eleanor was prepared. She knelt on the floor, pressing her ear to the wooden planks, and what she heard made her blood turn to ice. Beneath the rhythmic footsteps, she could make out voices, faint, muffled conversations that seemed to drift up through the floorboards like whispers from a grave. The voices were indistinct, but there was an urgency to them, a desperation that spoke of fear and confusion. Eleanor could not make out individual words, but the tone was unmistakable. These were the voices of people in distress, perhaps even in danger. She spent nearly an hour listening, moving across the library floor and trying to determine the source of the sounds. They seemed to emanate from an area roughly 20 feet by 30 feet, centered beneath the main reading area of the library. When the sounds finally stopped, just after 1 in the morning, Eleanor was left with more questions than answers. The rational part of her mind suggested that sound could travel in unexpected ways through old buildings, that perhaps she was hearing conversations from another part of the house, or even from outside. But the sounds had been too consistent, too clearly coming from directly beneath the library floor to be explained away so easily. The following day brought a winter storm that trapped Eleanor inside the manor, with only Mrs. Whitmore for company. The housekeeper had grown increasingly nervous since Eleanor mentioned the sounds, starting at every creak of the settling house and avoiding the library entirely. Eleanor used the enforced isolation to explore parts of the manor she had not yet thoroughly examined, searching for any explanation for the mysterious voices. In her uncle's bedroom, she discovered a locked drawer in an antique secretary desk. The key was hidden beneath a loose floorboard that Mrs. Whitmore, in her 15 years of service, had apparently never discovered. Inside the drawer, Eleanor found a collection of documents that painted a very different picture of her family's history than the one she had grown up believing. There were letters dating back to the 1850s, correspondence between her grandfather Cornelius and various men whose names Eleanor did not recognize. The letters spoke in careful, coded language about cargo and shipments and special accommodations. At first, Eleanor assumed these referred to her grandfather's textile business, but as she read more carefully, certain phrases began to stand out. References to southern merchandise and items requiring discreet handling suggested something far more significant than bolts of cloth or industrial equipment. One letter, dated September 1853, was more explicit than the others. It was written in her grandfather's careful script to a man named Joshua Brennan in Richmond, Virginia. The arrangements we discussed are now in place. The manor provides excellent facilities for temporary storage, and the location ensures complete privacy. Your associates may rest assured that any cargo delivered here will remain secure until collection can be arranged. The basement chambers have been modified according to your specifications, and no sound carries beyond the foundation walls. Eleanor read the letter 3 times before its implications fully registered. The timing coincided with the height of the Underground Railroad's operations in Massachusetts. Her family had always claimed to support the abolitionist cause, and the manor's location near the New Hampshire border would have made it an ideal station for helping enslaved people reach freedom in Canada. But this letter suggested something entirely different. It spoke of storage, security, and arrangements with someone in Richmond, a city that was firmly in the heart of the Confederacy. As the storm continued to rage outside, Eleanor searched through more of the hidden documents. She found receipts for construction work done in 1852, payments to local workers for excavation and masonry work in the manor basement. The amounts were substantial, far more than would be needed for simple storage or wine cellars. There were also payments to a man described as a specialist in discreet architecture, someone brought in from Boston specifically for this project. Among the papers, Eleanor discovered what appeared to be a financial ledger covering the years 1852 to 1861. The entries were cryptic, but they showed regular payments received from sources in Virginia, Maryland, and other southern states. The amounts were significant, enough to explain how her grandfather had been able to expand his textile business so rapidly during the 1850s. But more disturbing were the outgoing payments, regular sums paid to individuals described only by initials, with notations like recovery services and return arrangements. The pattern that emerged from these documents was chilling. Rather than helping enslaved people escape to freedom, it appeared that Cornelius Ravenwood had been operating a far more sinister enterprise. The manor served as a trap, a place where desperate fugitives were promised safe passage north, only to be held captive until they could be returned to their owners for a substantial bounty. That night, as Eleanor sat in the library surrounded by the evidence of her family's betrayal, the sounds beneath the floor took on a horrifying new meaning. The footsteps, the muffled conversations, the desperate tone of the voices. These were not supernatural phenomena, but echoes of human suffering that had taken place in the chambers beneath her feet. The storm lasted 3 days, and Eleanor used every hour to piece together the full scope of her family's operation. Hidden behind a false back in her grandfather's wardrobe, she found a detailed map of the manor's basement level. The drawings showed a complex network of chambers and tunnels that extended far beyond what any normal foundation would require. There were holding cells, each marked with a capacity number, and a separate area labeled processing room that connected to what appeared to be a hidden entrance accessible from the forest behind the manor. The map also revealed something that made Eleanor's stomach turn. The chambers were designed to be soundproof. Thick stone walls, multiple layers of wood and insulation, and a ventilation system that ensured the people held below could breathe but could not make themselves heard above ground. The only sounds that escaped were those that traveled through tiny gaps in the library floor, cracks that had developed over the years as the house settled and the wood aged. When the storm finally broke, Eleanor waited until Mrs. Whitmore had retired for the evening before making her way to the basement. The manor's lower level had always been off-limits during her childhood visits, described as nothing more than storage for coal and preserves. But armed with her grandfather's map, Eleanor discovered a hidden door behind what appeared to be a solid stone wall. The mechanism was cleverly concealed behind a loose stone that, when pressed, caused an entire section of the wall to swing inward on hidden hinges. Beyond lay a narrow corridor that led deeper into the earth than any normal basement would extend. Eleanor's oil lamp cast dancing shadows on the walls as she followed the passage, her heart pounding with each step. The first chamber she encountered was small, perhaps 8 feet square, with iron rings bolted into the stone walls and straw scattered across the floor. The air was thick with the smell of decay and something else, the lingering odor of human fear and desperation. Scratches on the walls told a story of desperation. Claw marks where fingernails had scraped against stone, and crude symbols that might have been attempts to keep track of passing days. Eleanor forced herself to continue down the corridor, documenting each chamber she found. There were 12 cells in total, each designed to hold between 2 and 6 people. At the end of the corridor, she discovered the processing room marked on her grandfather's map. This larger space contained shackles, chains, and a collection of documents that recorded the inventory that had passed through Ravenwood Manor over nearly a decade. The records were meticulous and horrifying. Each entry included a physical description, estimated age, and point of origin for the people who had been brought to the manor. There were notations about which slave catchers had delivered them, how long they had been held, and to whom they had ultimately been returned. The financial records showed that Cornelius Ravenwood had charged both ends of the transaction, collecting fees from the bounty hunters who brought captives to the manor, and receiving substantial payments from the southern plantation owners when their property was returned. But perhaps most disturbing were the entries that showed no return date, no payment for delivery back to the south. These records, marked with a simple D in red ink, numbered in the dozens. Eleanor realized with growing horror that not everyone who had been brought to Ravenwood Manor had survived long enough to be returned to slavery. Some had died in the underground chambers, whether from illness, despair, or deliberate neglect. As she made her way back through the corridor, Eleanor began to understand the sounds she had been hearing each night. The footsteps, the muffled conversations, the sense of desperate movement in a confined space. These were not supernatural hauntings, but the acoustical memory of a place where human suffering had been concentrated and prolonged. The voices carried up through tiny gaps in the flooring because the chambers had been designed to contain sound. But no containment system is perfect. Over the decades, the building had settled, wood had shrunk and expanded, and small openings had developed that allowed fragments of sound to escape. Eleanor's discovery of the underground chambers marked the beginning of the most disturbing period of her investigation. Each night, as she listened to the sounds beneath the library floor, she began to distinguish individual voices among the muffled conversations. There was a woman who seemed to be comforting a child, her voice rising and falling in what might have been a lullaby. There was a man who paced constantly, his footsteps wearing an invisible path across the chamber floor. And there were whispered conversations that carried the cadence of prayer, desperate appeals to a God who seemed to have abandoned this place. Armed with her grandfather's detailed records, Eleanor began to match what she was hearing with the documented cases of people who had been held in the chambers. The acoustics of the old building carried sound in unexpected ways, and she realized that the voices were not supernatural manifestations, but the result of air currents and sound waves that had been trapped and channeled through the stone and wood of the manor's structure for decades. During the day, Eleanor continued her research in the library, cross-referencing her grandfather's records with historical accounts of the Underground Railroad in Massachusetts. What she discovered painted an even more horrific picture of the manor's true purpose. Cornelius Ravenwood had systematically infiltrated the legitimate underground railroad network, offering his manor as a safe house for conductors who believed they were delivering freedom seekers to safety. The operation had been sophisticated and carefully planned. Ravenwood had cultivated relationships with genuine abolitionists, contributing money to anti-slavery causes and hosting meetings for local Underground Railroad organizers. He had established his reputation as a committed supporter of the cause, making it natural for conductors to trust him with their most precious cargo. The tragic irony was that many of the people who had delivered fugitive slaves to Ravenwood Manor believed they were completing successful rescues, never knowing that they had actually delivered their charges into a trap far worse than the plantations they had fled. Eleanor found correspondence that revealed how the scheme had finally come to an end. In late 1861, as the Civil War began and the Underground Railroad's operations became less critical, a conductor named Marcus Freeman had become suspicious when none of the people he had delivered to Ravenwood Manor ever sent word back to families still in bondage, as was customary among the Underground Railroad network. Freeman had returned to the manor unannounced and had apparently discovered evidence of the underground chambers. The final letter in Cornelius Ravenwood's files, dated December 1861, was addressed to the same Joshua Brennan in Richmond. "Our operations must cease immediately. The Freeman situation has been resolved, but the risk of exposure is now too great. The basement facilities will be sealed, and we must destroy all evidence of our arrangements. The war will provide sufficient cover for the disposal of any remaining inventory." Eleanor realized with growing dread that disposal likely referred to the people still being held in the underground chambers at the time. Her grandfather's meticulous records showed that in December 1861, there had been 17 people confined in the basement cells. None of them appeared in the return records, and all were marked with the red D that Eleanor now understood to mean deceased. But if you're finding this investigation as disturbing as Eleanor did, take a moment to share this video with someone who appreciates dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button if you're brave enough to hear how this story ends. And don't forget to subscribe for more hidden secrets that powerful families tried to bury forever. Let's uncover together what Eleanor found when she searched for the final resting place of those 17 souls. Eleanor's search for the final piece of the puzzle led her back to the hidden chambers with a different purpose. If her grandfather had disposed of 17 people in December 1861, their remains had to be somewhere on the property. The map she had found showed several areas marked as storage, but one section of the underground complex remained unexplored, a corridor that led away from the main chambers toward what appeared to be a natural cave system beneath the manor. Following this passage by lamplight, Eleanor discovered that the tunnel opened into a large cavern that had been incorporated into her grandfather's design. The space had been partially worked with stone and mortar, creating what could only be described as a crypt. Along the walls she found evidence of mass burial, areas where the natural stone floor had been broken and replaced, creating shallow graves that held the remains of an unknown number of people. But it was in the center of this underground cemetery that Eleanor made the most chilling discovery. 17 wooden markers, each bearing a number that corresponded to entries in her grandfather's final inventory. These were not the unmarked graves of forgotten victims, but a carefully documented record of murder. Cornelius Ravenwood had not simply allowed people to die through neglect or harsh conditions. He had systematically executed them to eliminate witnesses to his decade-long operation. Among the personal effects scattered around the burial area, Eleanor found items that brought the humanity of the victims into sharp focus. A child's wooden toy, carved in the shape of a horse. A woman's wedding ring, a simple band that someone had cherished even in captivity. A small Bible, its pages worn from handling, with passages about freedom and deliverance marked in fading ink. These were not just entries in a ledger, but human beings who had died believing they were on the verge of liberty. The final piece of evidence came from a letter Eleanor found tucked inside the small Bible. It was written in careful script, by someone named Sarah, addressed to "My beloved Samuel. If you are reading this, then the Lord has seen fit to reunite us in his kingdom. The man Ravenwood promised us passage to Canada, but I fear now that he means us harm. We have been here many days, and others who arrive before us speak of people who have been taken away and never returned. If I do not survive this place, know that my last thoughts were of you and our children. Tell them their mama died trying to reach them, and that freedom is worth any price, even this one." Eleanor sat in that underground crypt, surrounded by the evidence of her family's crimes, and finally understood the true source of the sounds that had haunted her nights. The voices she heard were not supernatural manifestations, but the acoustical legacy of this place. Sound waves that had been trapped and channeled through the stone and wood of the manor's structure, carrying forward the final conversations of people who had died in these chambers. The footsteps, the whispered prayers, the desperate conversations were all echoes of those final days in December 1861, when 17 souls had faced their end in the darkness beneath Ravenwood Manor. The realization that her family's wealth had been built on this systematic betrayal and murder was devastating enough. But Eleanor also understood that she was likely the first person to discover the truth about what had happened here. Her grandfather had taken his secrets to the grave, and her uncle had apparently lived his entire life above this hidden cemetery without ever knowing what lay beneath his feet. Eleanor emerged from the underground chambers as the sun was rising on her 15th day at Ravenwood Manor. The weight of what she had discovered seemed to press down on her shoulders like a physical burden. She now owned not just a house, but a monument to human cruelty that had been disguised as a family legacy. Mrs. Whitmore was waiting in the kitchen when Eleanor finally made her way upstairs. The housekeeper took one look at Eleanor's dirt-stained dress and lamp-soot-blackened hands and seemed to understand that the truth had finally been uncovered. "You found them, didn't you?" Mrs. Whitmore said quietly. "I always wondered, but I never had the courage to look. The sounds at night. I told myself it was just the old house settling, but in my heart, I knew better." Eleanor learned that Mrs. Whitmore's own grandfather had been one of the legitimate Underground Railroad conductors who had unknowingly delivered people to Cornelius Ravenwood. The family had lived with the shame and guilt for decades, never understanding why the people they thought they had saved had never sent word back to their families still in bondage. Mrs. Whitmore had taken the position at the manor 15 years earlier, hoping to find some evidence of what had really happened to those lost souls. Together, they made the decision that would define Eleanor's ownership of Ravenwood Manor. The underground chambers would be sealed, but not before proper burial rites were conducted for the remains they contained. Eleanor contacted a minister from Boston who specialized in cases involving historical injustices, and arrangements were made for the 17 documented victims to receive proper Christian burial in the Millbrook Cemetery. The process took months and required Eleanor to reveal the truth about her family's crimes to local authorities and historians. The scandal rocked the small community of Millbrook, where the Ravenwood family had been respected for generations. But Eleanor felt that the victims deserved recognition, even if it came decades too late. The manor itself presented a more complex problem. Eleanor could not bear to live in a house built on such suffering, but she also could not simply walk away and allow the truth to be buried again. She ultimately decided to donate the property to the Massachusetts Historical Society, with the stipulation that it be converted into a memorial for the victims of slavery and a research center dedicated to documenting the lesser-known aspects of the Underground Railroad. The transformation of Ravenwood Manor into a memorial site revealed additional evidence of her grandfather's operation. Historians found more documents hidden throughout the house, including correspondence with slave catchers throughout the South and financial records that showed the true scope of the betrayal network that had operated from Massachusetts to Virginia. But it was the restoration of the library that provided the final piece of Eleanor's puzzle. When workers removed the old flooring to install modern foundations for the memorial, they discovered that the gaps in the wooden planks had been deliberately created. Cornelius Ravenwood had designed the library floor with tiny openings that would allow sound to travel up from the chambers below. Not as an oversight, but as a form of psychological torture for future generations of his family. He had wanted his descendants to hear the voices of his victims, to live with the constant reminder of what their wealth had cost. Eleanor spent the rest of her life working with the memorial site, helping researchers document the stories of everyone who had passed through Ravenwood Manor. Some had survived and been returned to slavery, living to see emancipation and the end of the Civil War. Others, like Sarah and the 16 people buried alongside her, had died in the chambers beneath the library, their dreams of freedom transformed into a nightmare that lasted for decades. This story reminds us that the past is never truly buried, and that the echoes of injustice can carry forward through generations in ways we never expect. The sounds that Eleanor heard beneath the library floor were not supernatural, but they were no less real for being explainable. They were the voices of people who had been betrayed by someone they trusted, people who had died believing in a promise of freedom that was never meant to be kept. What do you think about Eleanor's decision to expose her family's crimes rather than protect their reputation? Do you believe she made the right choice in converting the manor into a memorial? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you to think about the hidden histories that might exist in your own community, share this video with someone who appreciates the importance of confronting difficult truths. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about the secrets that powerful families tried to take to their graves. And remember, the past is never as buried as we think it is. We'll see you in the next investigation.